Welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to host you here in the space of Gotong Royong Things We Do Together exhibition meeting, which is taking place now at Ujazdowski Castle, Center for Contemporary Art. And today we are meeting around the topic of the rise of global, or a global rise of nationalisms that we are observing in communities across the globe. With us, there are tonight Dr. Ewa Majewska, who is a feminist, philosopher, art critic, researcher, and activist. Clara Ianni, who is an artist from Brazil, who in her practice is investigating connections between art and political activity, political acts, and also nationalisms. And Imani Jacqueline Brown, activist, researcher from New Orleans. This meeting is a first in a series of events which we prepared for this week, which is the most significant day of this week is November 11th, Independence Day in Poland. Which we observe as a day when society seems to be like very visibly divided. Many of us seem stripped of our right to the city. The city is taken over by huge marches. Those marches turn into manifestations of nationalism, and not as much as a joyful moment to bring together the community. And this year I have heard that even like pretty much Neonazi groups are going to join, well, as usual they're joining, but they are even forming a special group called the Black Bloc, kind of like, I don't know, like normally anarchists make the Black Bloc, and now there is the neo-Nazis making a Black Bloc, but calling it a Black Column or something. They realized that Black Bloc maybe is not the best word. This exhibition meeting is titled Gotong Royong. Gotong Royong is the practice that is and a methodology that is widely used in Indonesia, and it describes these situations where people spontaneously, voluntarily, and in a horizontal organization simply get together to do things. So it's a very joyful, and it's a very powerful and positive practice. But we have also observed that communities are built not only around those positive, affirmative notions, but also as many times they are based on segregation. So today's meeting is a first in a cycle of several events that we are organizing in the frames of the exhibition, during which we are trying to look at the context of the Independence Day in Poland. Tomorrow we will also meet with Imani at 4 p.m. and there is going to be a kaleidoscope conversation about the origins of fascism. We are also going to have workshops for kids on Saturday when they will be making their own flags in the frames of the workshop called Wspólna Niepodległa, and perhaps we could take those flags and go to the march at 2 p.m. And at 5 p.m. I'm already inviting you to a little a cappella concert życzeń by Barbara Kinga Majewska in this space. So why did we decide to organize this meeting here today is because we wanted to discuss various contexts of how nationalisms are functioning in various corners of the world, beginning with Poland, going through New Orleans and Brazil. And again, I'm hoping that you will be familiar and not shy to use the microphone, and that we can turn this meeting into discussion, which we will not force. We hope that we will feel encouraged to take part in it. And now we decided that Ewa will start with a little keynote.
Okay, so I'm going to start not with a keynote, sorry Marianka to disappoint you, but with a little explanation about the pattern. So basically I'm going to speak for like, I don't know, 5 minutes, 7 minutes or something, and then we're going to go around, yeah? That's what we planned, or, yeah. So we're going to go around and ask you questions about your associations, or what do you think about nationalism, was it the question? What was the question actually? Because what do you associate with?
Yeah, what do you feel, what do you think about when you hear the word nationalism?
Yeah. So this kind of loose associations that you might have. So we're going to make a round with these, and then we'll pass the mic to Inani, and then there's going to be a round again, and then Clara will sort of conclude the session. So it's going to be a bit more interactive than, you know, talking heads kind of pattern of, keynote, and I'm super grateful to all of you that you decided to come here and participate in it. And also, I was thinking that today our publics are not, I don't know, somehow I'm tired of this pattern of enlightening you, and I'm super curious, much more curious actually, about what we can discuss, talk about, what we can do together about nationalism, rather than to give you a definition of it or whatever. I mean, I'm going to try to tell you what I think about it, right? But it's not going to necessarily be very kind of lecture style enunciation, rather an invitation to share your experiences if you have. So I'm super grateful to all of you for coming here, but also to Marianka for making this exhibition. And I need to stress this thing that I told you privately, but now it's going to become public. So beware. Marianka has been doing the international residencies in the castle for, I don't know, how many?
Many years.
Many years, 15, something like this, yeah, a long period of work. And then she's been, like with these years, obviously she's been developing a certain pattern of collaboration, of curatorial work, etc., which has rarely been visible for more general audiences. So all these artists and people, professionals with whom you were collaborating, they know it, but I think for a more general public, so it's quite a big celebration for me, and quite a big event that you have an exhibition, and that the popular public and much bigger amount of people can see how you work with artists, and I'm very proud of it. And also that's a kind of, I don't know, a kind of feminist remark perhaps, that there is a certain invisibility of many female curators. Perhaps there are some who are visible obviously, but there are some who focus so much on the process of the making of artworks, of collaborations, etc., that somehow they don't gain the visibility granted to curators who have a kind of strong hand curating, you know, big slogans, and also who are more occupying more space, but also who are more explicit and discursive with their practice. So I was always quite amazed by how Marianka sort of does not repeat this hegemonic position, hegemonic curatorial style, and how it's a kind of, I don't know, I would call it weak curating because it's close to what I do. But so even if in actual practice it can be quite a strong-handed, still it has several symptoms, starting with certain invisibility, but also a kind of moderating process rather than establishing rules, which I find quite interesting. So, and on this note, it makes sense actually to begin with this. So I'm happy to be here again, and but also I think it's a good starting point for discussing nationalism. So to me, nationalism is extremely sort of it's a bigger version of ego sort of structure, ego building, ego preoccupation, and that's the lens I perceive it. So in Freudian psychoanalysis, obviously we have this disclaimer that where id used to be, there should it should become ego. And in this version, it doesn't sound that dangerous. But if we think of nations as concepts, but also as kind of war machines that organize our lives, whether we like it or not, also in these brutal ways that we observe every year around National Independence Day on 11th of November here in Poland. But also, as we've observed, or as actually our grandparents observed in the times of the Second World War, for instance, these machines become much more dangerous and much more sort of not only self-preoccupied, which would perhaps could not be so problematic, but also generating so much hatred, distinctions, violence, and eventually also homicides. So in Poland, the word nationalism usually is associated with those brutal expressions of nationalistic feelings and sentiments. That's, I think, the basic association that we might have with this notion. So it might come up quite strong, but also it has been fueled by the experiences, especially of the Second World War. I think this is where nationalism as one of the key concepts organizing the fascist sort of political imaginary and fascist politics obviously brings still extremely strong, brutal memories. So, so to me, living and somehow my perception of nationalism is built in a process of personalized, embodied experience of living in Warsaw. So this is also not a very public statement, and probably in a scientific field I would have to build a very strong sort of structure of situated knowledge, and I would probably have to explain myself for a long time on how I sort of produce a knowledge of nationalism via my own experience. But I believe this is possible to be done, but it would take much more than 5 minutes, so I'm not going to go there. But I'm just signalizing, right, that this element of personalized embodied experience is methodologically important for my understanding of nationalism. And for me, living in Warsaw and crossing, you know, the borders of the Jewish ghetto on daily basis, going through districts which were inhabited by the Jewish minorities, going through streets and buildings which were washed, literally washed with blood of people who were killed because of fascism and because of nationalistic ideology. This makes my experience of nationalism a particular one and quite a critical one. And also there is this practice that I've shared with you when we were preparing for this panel, which is a very practical sense of never again. So to me, never again, to many of you, never again might sound like a, you know, anti-fascist slogan or some sort of inheritance after the Second World War or some other version of slogan, I don't know. But to me, it's actually on daily basis that I sort of, on one hand, think, on the other hand, sort of ask myself, not literally, what have I done for this never to happen again, because this would be a little bit too cartoony or too good to be true. But still, this question sort of is around my head, and the experiences of not being in Warsaw, which I have practiced for many years. So all kinds of traveling and forced precarity, I would say, forced academic precarity that I went through in the last 10 years. In all these other places that I was living, I felt very uncomfortable somehow because this duty was not present there. So obviously in other countries, I think you should also fight fascism, if possible, if you can. But still, it wasn't that brutally present, I would say, as it is here. So for me, this presence in a city where an extremely atrocious fascist occupation had taken 6 years almost, this presence, these buildings, this chaotic structure of the city makes me always sort of go back to this super radical version of nationalism and opposed to it. So I'm going to conclude with a sort of paraphrasing Gayatri Spivak, one of my favorite theorists and also a person whom I translated into Polish partially. Hopefully one day I'll do the whole book, but it's not easy, believe me. So in 1985, Spivak wrote this text about value, actually, and in the end of this text, she says something very interesting about Habermas and her attitude towards Habermas and Habermas's concept of public sphere. She says that Habermas's concept should not be rejected, simply rejected. It should be opposed on daily basis. So that's the kind of attitude that I have towards nationalism. I'm sort of opposing it on a daily basis. And this would be, for now, what I want to say. So now we should do this microphone sharing thing. So if there is anybody who wants to say what they associate with nationalism, I would gladly invite you to do it. Otherwise, I'll just go to one of you or two of you. Yeah, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Maciej Piasecki. I work as a journalist. I write about nationalism on, well, not daily basis, but that's one of my key points of interest. And so I need to be quite detached from the term, and it's become a really loaded term in Poland in the recent years, especially because on the most basic level, the idea of nationalism is that. Well, the strongest parts of our identities are our nationalities, and therefore we should live in nation states. Each of you has different key points of your identity. Like some of you would say, like you're fans of modern art, fans of music, you like cooking. But like the idea of nationalism is that the most important part of yourselves is your nationality. The fact that you're Polish or whatever your nationality is, and especially in the recent years, the idea of nationalism, and especially in the Polish language, has become strongly entwined with the ideas of racism, homophobia, xenophobia, Islamophobia. So it's become a vessel for these really brutal far-right, even neo-Nazi ideas. The ideas that one nation can be supreme towards the others, and we can see that right now in the US, where people like Richard Spencer, who was invited to take part in the celebrations of the Independence Day in Poland. He's yeah, he was. No, he's not coming because well, even the current Foreign Office in Poland made a statement that he's unwelcome in Poland, and he apparently he was afraid he's going to be stopped at the border of the Schengen area. So so he's not coming. Even people like that in Poland tend to be associated with nationalism, with weirdly perceived patriotism, and so it's really interesting what you're asking, like what do we associate with nationalism, because that's a really blurred term, and it's really really easy to oversimplify. I would strongly suggest to use the word in this really narrow sense, that like the one I explained in the first place, and try to pinpoint. Of course.
Because when you say that you recommend the sense that you gave, to me it's quite problematic, because somehow, I don't know, my family, for instance, they come from all kinds of places actually. They are not from, you know, so when I'm asked, where do you come from, what is your nationality, where do you come from, I can say Poland is a geographic notion as well, right? So that's easy. But what is your nationality? Seriously, you know, there are even, I mean, like all kinds of familial things, but also a kind of deep internationalism that I have as a political sort of mindset also doesn't allow me to answer this kind of question very easily. So, I don't know if you want to...
Well, what year do we have? 2017. The ideas of nationalism was born in the we could say early 19th, maybe late 18th century. So it's been redeveloped. It's been used in various contexts. But we should. I'm not saying that the idea of a nation state is a bad one. I'm not saying it's a good one. It's an idea. We can follow it or not. Well, currently in the European Union, we see some opposing ideas whether we should accept the European identity and federalize the European state. Yeah.
Like to circulate. Sorry.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So,
thanks so much. And yeah, let's share with others. Perhaps we do a round or something.
Doesn't have to be so comprehensive, but just thoughts, words, things, impressions, feelings that come to mind when you hear the word nationalism.
I was going to say exclusion, sovereignty, power, as liminality, and the creation of like inside and exterior, and a notion of the enemy that's created when through the transition of capitalism and alongside that the nation state.
Well, I just wanted to basically agree with what Maciek said, and one more clarification to what you said before. Black bloc is a strategy of fighting on the street, which relates to whole groups dressed in full black without any logos or anything like that. So it's just the far right is adapting to the same techniques that the radical left wing is using, basically. And outside of that, I just wanted to say that nationalists tend to justify the reasons by this cultural inheritance argument, which is always a huge problem because as a person, I'm not a huge fan of discussing with Nazis, so I struggle with this one. But the way they put it out is that in a situation where globalization is ongoing, we need to preserve our local cultures and whatnots. And to this, I could agree to some point, but at a regional level, whereas as long as people don't get rid of, as long as people struggle with talking with each other despite their cultural background, we won't be able to fix this problem anytime soon. So, in my opinion, and that's where my opinion differs with Maciek's, I think states are a bad thing in the long run. And the reasoning is because a nation state creates division within the society itself. I mean, you were born in here, and you're just basically, since you were born, you're limited to the community that is artificially created by the borders of your country, which to me sounds ridiculous. And I thought that in the 21st century, and considering the advancements of human interactions throughout the last 20 years, we wouldn't end up in a situation like we had almost 100 years ago, which is pretty terrifying. That's it.
Yeah, I think what I want to say kind of refers to what you just said in a way, that I haven't really done proper scientific research on nationalism or nationalisms around the world, but what I noticed studying bits of history of different countries during the periods of so-called nation building, it always happens by the cost is the actual ethnic diversity and regional cultures of the country that are being erased in the name of building a homogeneous nation. And that's what happened in Poland a lot, especially in within the 20th century, that we've lost a lot of knowledge about the diversity of Polish culture or Polish cultures in general, for the sake of building one homogeneous nation, Polish nation. And I've seen that happen with the huge damage in countries like Indonesia or everywhere around the world, basically. Each country is a lot more diverse than what the state usually proposes as the definition of the nation. And we've seen that happen. We've seen that, those kind of antagonisms growing all around the place, wherever the so-called nation building was happening. And this is very interesting what you mentioned, the more contemporary context, that now with the globalization and people kind of naturally crossing the mental borders of their own country, while being so exposed to like the cultures that are interacting with each other on a daily basis, and living in Poland, working in England, traveling somewhere to see their friends like on the other end of the world, and getting involved in for example, activist movements that are global but still kind of come from like grassroots context. We like basically the idea of nationalism that to me was always kind of wrong, like starting from a wrong point of departure. These days is becoming more and more overdated in a way that in Poland we have loads of Polish citizens, Polish-born, who grew up in this country, and this is their first country. But one of their parents, for example, has comes from Africa or somewhere in Africa, or from Latin America or somewhere else in Europe. And then the question is, like, how can you feel at home in your own country if you're always perceived as a foreigner, as an alien? And one thing that really touched me, one photo reportage that I saw a couple of years ago, I think, that I felt like this is some kind of idea how to approach the questions of national identity, although it was done with very standard means. It kind of had the effect, I think. That's what its intention was. It was a photo reportage of Polish people who are not the Polish Slavic type, so like young people, basically teenagers or people in their 20s with mixed race, basically wearing Polish traditional costumes from the regions where they were born. And this is the kind of way I think we should try to propose on like a level of social debate in Poland about national identity, like exploring Polish culture in its diversity, like in its traditional diversity, combined with the diversity of the contemporary context of the country that we're living in right now. That's all I want to say.
No, it's super cool. Actually, I'm wondering whether we should pass the mic on you now and then continue the general discussion. Is it okay? Or
yeah, sure. Yeah, so first of all, I want to thank you all for speaking with me in English. I am in Poland and am trying to speak a little bit of Polish. It's a really beautiful and complex language. And I have the privilege and I'm grateful to be able to travel a lot. And I am constantly aware of the privileges that I have as a native English speaker. And I find it really interesting that English has become the international language of exchange, cultural exchange, economic exchange, the language of imperialism, the language of colonialism, both British and American, has become the language that allows us to get closer together, to maybe come to some kind of an understanding. And I have lots of questions about how right that is, and you know, how fair it is, and whatever happened to Esperanto, the language of hope that was supposed to bring us all together, that we learned actually was founded in 1887, that has a few million speakers. Sorry? Oh, in Białystok. I didn't know that. See, really interesting. So what happened there, right? And I don't have answers. I'm gonna give you guys a little hint, a little cheat about my entire talk. I don't have any answers. I have endless questions. I have experiences, maybe some hypotheses. But the work that I'm increasingly becoming interested in and that I'm trying to explore here at the CAC is around the notion of truth. Because I think all of us who are coming here to this exhibition, who are coming to this conversation about nationalism this evening during dinner time, probably have some pretty strong feelings and opinions about nationalism, and we probably believe very firmly that our opinions are the correct opinions, that our opinions could even pass for facts. And I'm not saying that that's false, because it could very well be true. But each one of us who is feeling that, we can't all be right at the same time, can we? And all of us who are in the world who feel that our truth is the one, the only truth, cannot possibly be all correct, unless we can. So I wonder often, I've been becoming increasingly conscious of language, of the limitations of language, even when we all speak English together, whether we really are speaking the same language, whether the words that we are using mean the same thing, whether the weight of all of our experiences compact completely different meanings into the same word. I think a lot about the words like democracy and freedom, which in my experience of coming of age in the United States, of being 13 when 9/11 happened, and never forget, 9/11, and I watched as a city, New Orleans, that had always prided itself on being somehow both inside and outside of the United States, as being Little Africa, as being the northernmost Caribbean, as being the most European American city. We had a saying, New Orleans is third world and proud of it, because of the economic conditions and the racial segregation in our city, which has led to a singular and pretty phenomenal culture formed in the face of oppression. Despite all of this upbringing, all of this pride, we too fell into the trappings of nationalism and patriotism after 9/11, when it seemed that our national borders had been penetrated by some great unknowable other. And I found it horrifying, and I watched as these big monster trucks that people drove around were suddenly flanked by 4 giant American flags, and I stood by as every single morning in middle school we had to sing "I'm proud to be an American" with our hand on our heart, really out of tune. And the lady who was playing guitar, like, how do you find the one person in New Orleans who can't play guitar, and have her lead this little sing-along? And I refused to sing, and I refused to put my hand on my heart. And my friends and I, a lot of people actually, a lot of kids were like, this is terrible, this is a bad song. Like, why is this occupying space in my mind? A lot of people, plotted on how when the song got to the part where it said, "And we stand up next to you," we would all just sit down. And we never really did it. And then in 9th grade the next year, shock and awe happened, the US's campaign of shock and awe in Iraq. And I remember it being on television in my environmental science classroom, and I remember our class sitting and watching it, and little American boys cheering as we watched this barrage of bombs rain down on Baghdad, as though they were watching some sort of a fireworks display. And I just wondered, what is this? What are we doing here? What are we learning? What are we growing? What are we building? And this, truth that we built in this time, this truth that we Americans had been violated, that we were in danger, that we needed to fear each other, that we needed to watch each other, that if we see something, we have to say something, that we needed to watch these color-coded warnings on TV, watch for the moment when it switched from yellow to orange to red, and then go out and buy a bunch of tarp and duct tape and do what with it. They never quite explained what we were supposed to do with all this garbage that we were supposed to go out and buy to save us from some unknowable fear. And I, as a child, grew up in this environment realizing that I had to question everything. And if I didn't question everything that I was told constantly, and my parents, I was lucky to have parents who reinforced this, if I didn't question everything, I would fall into this trap and I would become like them. And I was lucky that in addition to growing up in a place that had always seen itself as external to the United States, as not one of the beneficiaries of American exceptionalism, I also could travel a lot with my mother, who is an international law professor. And so I got the opportunity to go to lots of other countries and cultures and get by with the little scraps of whatever language I could kind of heap together and learn about other people's experiences. And this experience of travel, of exchange, I think is incredibly important for beating back these waves of nationalism. And it's brought me here, and this is an incredible experience. But increasingly, I've become really disturbed by the impacts of this lifestyle, of my attempts to seek out knowledge and commiseration and form these translocal bonds and develop friendships that can carry over the course of many years. I'm realizing that I'm building a pretty hefty carbon footprint. And I'm realizing that even this wonderful cross-cultural, transnational commiseration that we're figuring out how to build, that we're now more able than ever before to develop, to maybe beat back nationalisms and fascisms, even that can't be our savior, because at least the way that we travel today is really, frankly, going to kill all of us and everything that we love. So what to do with that? And of course, also, to be able to travel is a privilege. I've worked hard and long and had an incredible number of lucky chances and weird experiences, like being a part of Occupy Wall Street, that have actually brought me to this moment. And all of these things, even the hard work and all the luck, all of these are the benefits of privilege. So what about everyone else? Who is this everyone else that we're always talking about? We use these us and they and other, and we feel that we're breaking it down by having these conversations, but we also need to ask ourselves how we all came to be in this room. So we need new systems. We need new life support for a society that is really struggling to survive, but we haven't quite grasped it yet. We need inspiration, which is what I think these exhibitions like this do so well, these projects do so well, these conversations coming together, figuring out creative ways of listening better, of learning better, new strategies, new modalities of learning. We need history. We need a history that is not selective. We need a history that crosses political boundaries, political borders. I'm curious about learning not just left-wing histories, but also right-wing histories, and having those experiences and balancing them out. And I'm wondering how we can better incorporate that multiplicity of history, of truth, of people's understanding of truth, whether we like it or not, into our educational experiences. And I'm realizing increasingly how important history is for me in a place like New Orleans to understand. For those who don't know, New Orleans is a part of the state of Louisiana, and it was the heart of the transatlantic slave trade in the United States. And today, the city of New Orleans is the prison capital of the world. So the state of Louisiana imprisons more people than anywhere else in the world. We imprison more people than China or Iran, these great unknowable other enemies, or Russia. And the city of New Orleans imprisons more people than anywhere else in the state of Louisiana. In Louisiana, former slave plantations have leased their land to petrochemical corporations, creating places like the river parishes that are, it's known as Cancer Alley, where there are incredibly disproportionate rates of cancer among these towns of formerly enslaved peoples. So the place that I come from is known as a sacrifice zone because our country has really written us all off, especially after Hurricane Katrina 12 years ago. And so we're there, and we've developed, again, these cultures that allow us to be resilient in the face of all this oppression. But we're not able to reconcile with these histories. We're not able to see the way that the history of slavery, the history of colonialism, the history of the Banana Republic are all so present and alive in contemporary Louisiana. And that can be said across the entire United States. And I think that this ahistoricism is really what's driving the far-right push in the US today. And it's, again, it's not just about the ahistoricism on the right. There's also an ahistoricism on the left, as left-wing pundits say, well, look to the founding fathers. They wouldn't have wanted it this way. Well, the founding fathers were not just slave owners. Even Ben Franklin, who was against slavery, believed that once slavery ended, we should just ship all black people back to Africa. And on the left, in contrast to far right-wing white supremacist nationalism, we have black nationalism, saying that, well, black people need their own state, which I certainly want no part of. And I agree with the comment that the state is ultimately dividing us. And I wonder what is the future, as we know that these global pressures of climate change, of crisis are creating enormous population shifts, that the nation state was only created in 1648. It's not the only way that people have ever and will ever organize their societies. So what's next? What is global citizenship? What does that look like? Not in the TPP kind of corporate governance sense, but true global citizenship. And I think I'll end it there and open it up to more questions. So the project that I'm organizing here at the CCA is called Truth as Theatrical Fiction, and it's a series of conversations of questions without answers. It's using a tool called the Kaleidoscope Conversation, which I learned just earlier this year. It's a tool that everyone should feel happy to steal. And because I stole it from someone. I don't even know who. And basically, it's a conversation of questions without answers. So there's a seed question, and then someone responds to that question with another question, and so on and so forth. And there will be pauses, and it might feel kind of weird and clunky and uncomfortable sometimes, but we should get more comfortable with being uncomfortable. And it's an interesting way of probing not just what we don't know, not just lowering the barrier of entry for conversation, but also seeing where we're afraid to allow our mind to wander. So catch yourself if you have questions in your mind that you don't want to actually articulate, and maybe try to do so.
Imani, before you cite the question, I just wanted to say that maybe this little exercise we do without microphones, so that it's like we don't need to translate it, and it's more, and we hear each other, so it's going to be more spontaneous.
Great. So the question I'll start with is, can we imagine a future outside of the nation?
Okay, so I slowly will introduce some of the things I prepared. Some of them I'll simply dropped because I think we already discussed. And well, first of all, thank you all for coming. And I'm sorry for my English. Sometimes I get quite nervous about expressing myself in English, and I tend to be very quick and make a lot of confusion. So please make a sign if it gets too confusing. So what I thought about bringing to our conversation today is something based on my own experience, which is being born in a peripheral country, not that peripheral, but now maybe it came back to the third world position, but it's Brazil. And I think a lot of the questions you raised here are interesting for me and for us because they are quite actually pretty organic in our own social life. Brazil, for Brazilians and from Brazil, the very nation, the very idea of the nation is quite a strange idea, or at least a controversial idea, because if we remember, Brazil was a former colony of Europe for 500 years. It was a colony of Portugal. It based its labor relations for 400 years over slavery, over expulsion of indigenous people from the land. So basically, there was a whole system of regulation and exploitation that was already international back 500 years ago. So basically, the economy was produced, and the wealth was going to either Portugal, England, or Netherlands. The political system, the administration of the land was based in Europe. So this idea of the unity, which is also a very monotheistic political formation, the idea of having a one political expression of a community, is for us very strange, because Brazil being formed by indigenous people, black people coming from Africa, refugees from Europe from the Second World War, and the colonizers, the settlers in the beginning of the colonization. This idea of unity is very strange because we don't share the same language, we don't share the same religion, we don't share the same ethnicity, and we don't share history. So the interesting thing is that for us, since the very proclamation of the Republic, or whatever, the very formation of the country, the notion of the nation or the nation state is already a very contradictory political expression, because somehow the political regime was imported or imposed by Europe. So we would have a nation state, but also we would have slavery. So the nation state was for us at least not a matter of emancipation, but rather a matter of maintaining privilege and class exploitation over the other. So what I think it's interesting maybe to bring to the discussion is that culture has a huge role in that also for us, even though our own experience is very contradictory and maybe more radical in this sense, but the idea of culture and the election of certain aspects of the community culture as to be the one who would then represent the unity of a very heterogeneous community is very interesting. And this idea that Ewa was speaking about, the projection from the present into the past, to then kind of create a coherent narrative, to be able to explain something that happens today, I think it's very interesting and should be addressed. How can we not only face I mean, the great heroes, the great narratives, the great monuments, the great myths, who actually are those myths of birds, these inventions, how not only we can create a sort of confrontation with that, but we are able to create different forms of narrating that. And then I remember what you asked about how much we can assume conflict as part of the political space, because maybe an effective tool to fight against fascism and these illusions of unity, which are also a parenthesis, they are correlated. There is, for me, a sense of correlation between the nation state and the individual, or the bourgeois individual, this unique formation that does not assume any conflict. Is you have one idea, you have one identity, and you should express this unique form of yourself. So somehow the individual form within the being and the nation state, somehow they are similar. But nevertheless, how much can we then create forms of expression and of political exercise then are capable to deal with contradictions, to deal with differences, instead of just creating the exclusion? How can we, and not include, but create space for debate and for conflict, and maintain the conflict as a political force of our social experience. So in that sense, I would argue that not only we have to fight counter-narratives and to try to displace myths and great fathers and whatever, but we have also to, and that is the invention, maybe the artistic invention, to create this different form, the open form, or a form which is not exclusionary. And one of the things, I will skip everything, but maybe one of the things I would like to close with my intervention here is something. At least from Brazil, we realize that even though the nationalism and the idea of nation is a very artificial one, if we confront that with our history, what is very symptomatic is whenever we have economic crisis, the rise of nationalism will immediately go up, because it's a manner of trying to maintain the sense of community together. And what probably you also know, we just had another coup a couple of years ago, which is connected to a very strong economical crisis. And the fascist, the Nazis, the nationalist discourse is also rising again. So one of the things and one of the aspects I think are important for us to observe is that the economy in the social space was collapsing. The forms of exchange between us was absolutely commodified, meaning that all of the other aspects of social interaction were absolutely capitalized or transformed into product, as we are doing here. We are not simply talking, we are being recorded, we are being translated, we are going to be uploaded somewhere else. That means productivity, right? So all of the forms of human interactions were being commodified, and somehow we have the rise of nationalism, which we restore in a sense, as well as the rise of the evangelical community in South America, but restores the sense of community beyond individualization, beyond the consumer subject, which is also the subject of the left. And maybe that's why we are not capable to answer in a proper manner sometimes, because we are trapped in the idea of the capitalist subject, no? Which consumes identity, consumes products, and so on, and we are not able to form other bounds of community beyond those interactions which are absolutely commodified. So I've been thinking in that, and I've been thinking artistic practice, how can we build this different modes of social interaction, and how can we face this crisis and these deadlocks that are in front of us now. So that's it.
Can I just jump?
Yes.
So basically, I was thinking of two things. One of them is this construct of, as you called it, European. You didn't call it European subjects, but I will call it European subjects. So bourgeois subject, yeah, which sounds familiar. Yeah. So the bourgeois European autonomous subject. That's the word I'm also quite keen on. So this autonomy is interesting, right? Because some people mentioned the word emancipation. It's quite hard to imagine emancipation without a certain autonomy, right? A certain sort of resilient self. So, and I believe this concept of nation has also, I mean, if we look at the Polish context, there is, on one hand, we do have neighbors, right? Some people don't notice even their neighbors, but in the context of Poland, you mentioned Russophobia. So obviously Russophobia didn't come from the sky, but it sort of became a historical narrative. I would say a sort of revanchist narrative from a country which has been, for the majority of time, either opposing Russia or being occupied by it, right? So there is a sense of, I'm not saying that any of these stereotypes are just or whatever, justified, because they are not, obviously, but there is a sense of sort of fight which obviously translates into stereotypes and then phobias of whatever kind, and that's one of them. And I believe also we can speak about the German phobia, I would say, Germanophobia, right? So similar attitude. So this is one thing. This problem of constructing entities, also group social entities, which do not repeat kind of fascist exclusions and tortures and atrocities in order to build themselves, but yet which can sustain the people who belong there. Yeah, so I think there is I mean, if we want to criticize nationalism, which I think we should in this or that way, we should also think, as you rightly pointed to, of how, okay, so what's the togetherness that we can produce, right? And what sense of belonging and community, etc. I was also thinking of nation and nationalism as a discourse which somehow in connection with what you said in the questions, which sort of takes away the necessity of thinking of exploitation and gives us a sort of substitute. So to me, nationalism and fascism are political strands and ideologies which precisely do that. So somehow there is a sense of transition from understanding our conditions and possibly our oppression in materialistic terms. It sort of becomes a matter of a nation. But on the other hand, in the colonial context, in the context of all kinds of occupations, the issue of oppression of a whole group who shares the same culture and language, ethnicity, perhaps also, at least partially. So the sense of oppression, of colonial oppression, it is, I think, still quite complicated to express it without this idea of a nation. I mean, it would be very hard to explain what was happening in the territories of Poland without a reference, this kind of national reference somehow. So this is problematic for me. I would like something else to be there at hand to discuss instead of the nation context. So I also disagree with you, I'm sorry to say. But similarly to you, I think this concept should be sort of perhaps abandoned but replaced also with something. So I wouldn't just leave it like this. And I was also thinking of Polish nationalism and something that I promised to say and I forgot. We have this idea of heroic messianicism as an element, a driving element, I think, a key element of our nation concept. Basically, this, if there is any Polish nation, which I think exists only phantasmagorically as a sort of, you know, perhaps empty signifier sort of floating above our heads. So if there is anything like that, then it's definitely driven by sacrifice. So on one hand, this whole patriotic exhibitionism that happens every 11 November on the Independence Day presents, you know, men, Polish men, especially some women as well, but mainly it's a very masculine sort of performance. So they show their heroism and readiness to die for their country. If you ask the people who go to these demonstrations, they will tell you not only that they, you know, commemorate the anniversary of the recreation of the Polish state after 123 years of inexistence, but they are ready to die. On the other hand, the anti-abortion narrative that currently develops itself within the government and conservative milieus, and which is extremely powerful, and we are really threatened to lose our even small rights to reproductive policies. I think this is also driven by this heroism. So there is a version for women, to put it shortly, a version of heroic messianism for women. You will suffer. You know, you're pregnant, you will suffer. You will not get any anesthetics. You will not examine your body and the fetus before giving birth. You have to go through it because this is how I understand this narrative, because that's the only way of understanding it to me. Otherwise, it just sounds crazy. But the way that I look at it is basically we demand similar heroism on the side of women as we demand on the side of men. So men should be ready to sacrifice their lives, and women as well.
Hi, Elżbieta. I was thinking about, you know, how the idea of nation is gendered and how it is structured to resemble the idea of family, right? So it's more about the structure of power, really, than anything else, in a sense. So you can have the structure of power which is clearly delineated, which is clearly seen. You have the head of the family, which is the one which is male, right, who yields the power, and then you have the subordinates, which are, you know, different.
Everybody else, basically.
Everybody else, right? But I'm also thinking how this idea, on the one hand, seems to be so natural, right? So, because it is naturalized, but also how malleable it is. So, I'm always wondering, you know, to what extent the whole ideology is bad and to what extent it can be turned upside down and so on. And in that sense, I'm thinking about my experience of being Polish working in Sweden, in which country you have nationalism based on the idea of openness, tolerance, you know, nation branding in terms of, you know, gender equality, and being, you know, accepting refugees and so on. To what extent this is reality and to what extent it is, and this is another question, but I think that comparing it to Poland, I would say it's great, it's wonderful, like I want to be there. In that sense, of course, is depending on where would you like to who would you like to compare with, but it's quite interesting how they reimagined themselves or reinvented themselves in a way in which you have the nation building process as something which not necessarily goes into the direction of, you know, idealizing nation in terms of blood, stock, family, and so on, but rather thinking about, you know, embracing progress as something that is a sort of brand for your nation, right? So in that sense, I'm thinking about how malleable it is and how much nation-building process is always a process of reinventing the past. So I happen to be from Białystok, which is the hometown of Zamenhof. And
the creator of Esperanto.
Yes, the creator of Esperanto, who, Białystok has also been a home of one of the largest Jewish population before the Second World War. And it's quite interesting how I've been schooled to know quite a lot about Zamenhof, Esperanto, and so on. We have Esperanto Center, we have Esperanto Street, blah, blah, blah. But nobody actually talks about the fact that he was a Jew by origin, and I didn't know anything about actually the history of the Jewish population. In Białystok, the fact that there has been a second largest uprising after Warsaw and so on and so forth. I had to move out of Białystok to get to know this knowledge. So it's really an example of how we can reinvent the past, which theoretically epitomize the same values, right? Esperanto as the symbol of a transnational connection, creating the language which allows people to connect to others, and so on and so on. So theoretically, the values behind this image are things that we would like to subscribe to. But the reality which this story marginalizes is something that tells you a lot about why and how this story has been invented or structured in a certain way. So in that sense, I'm always thinking about, you know, how these narratives are, you know, to what extent they are attached to a specific types of political context, and to what extent we can take them, make use of them, and in that sense, it's not about wholesale refusal of, you know, accepting their existence or everyday resistance, as you said, Ewa, but more about, you know, negotiating in a sense, accepting this conflict which is inherent in this structure, and also trying to change the power structure or how power operates within this context. And it is a very dangerous game, and we have been trying at this for some time now, with some successes and some failures. But I think it's something that always interests me as a sociologist, as a scholar, but also as an activist, as a person who's interested in art world or whatever. So in that sense, it's something that I would like to sort of bring to the table.
Thank you. When you used an expression that the nation, the Swedish nation, reinvented itself, using those values and reinterpreting their history to build like a new idea of what Swedishness is. I had that little light come up on in my mind because I actually spent some time in Sweden as well. Like I had some connections with Sweden for a while, and became close with a lot of Swedish people there. And my impression while I was there, based on what I observed, but also like in everyday life, but also based on like contemporary Swedish films and basic like expressions of their contemporary culture, is that, well, my question is, who were those people who reinvented the new term of, or the new idea of Swedishness? Because in my impression, those weren't the 100% of Swedish people that you come by, that you meet on the streets, even in Stockholm, right? I had an impression that a lot of people were feeling very limited by the Swedish political correctness to express their views, their ideologies that were contrary to what the idea of contemporary Swedishness is. That in fact there is a lot of suppressed negative nationalist feelings, a lot of suppressed feelings like antagonisms about foreigners in their country, about class struggle, that is like a taboo thing, because they have that idea of their country being super liberal and left-wing and tolerant and progressive, when in fact there is still a lot of social tensions that are not being expressed, are not being discussed, because they, in like the public discourse, it is considered non-existent, and in fact it's there, it's just people don't talk about it.
Can I add to what you just said, because on a similar note slightly, my impressions, I also lived in Sweden for a couple of months, were often that I'm being sort of treated as a secondary person because I come from Poland, and people in Poland, it was assumed, are not as progressive. So they assumed immediately about me things that they wouldn't ask me, you know, are you a Marxist or not or something.
Yeah, that's the thing, that I met a lot of Swedish people who were second generation foreigners in Sweden. So they were born Swedish, spoke Swedish, Sweden was their motherland or fatherland or whatever, and they were still treated as second-rate citizens, and that translated to economical status, to status at work and all that, only because they were not blonde Swedish people who have been there, like their families have been there for ages, because of those associations that if you are a foreigner or if you come from a foreign family, you represent a culture that is foreign to us tolerant Swedes. You're probably some kind of conservative Muslim, and you're bringing bad habits to our perfect tolerant country, and that actually happens to a lot of Swedish people who are being treated as second-rate citizens for their cultural heritage or their ethnical heritage. And that's one thing. And another thing is that maybe back in the 50s or 40s, or between the 40s and 70s, when that new idea of Swedishness being so open and tolerant was invented, that was probably the political elites or leftist activists who reinvented that story of what Swedishness is and spread the idea around, and a lot of Swedish people probably believed in that then. But these days, that country faces so many tensions that are contemporary context, that less and less people actually agree with that idea of Swedishness that was invented by one ideological side of the Swedish society. And this is what Imani mentioned, I think, in the beginning of her talk, is that we need to keep on asking ourselves, right? Like, if things that we believe to be true, are they like absolute truth, or like why do we have a tendency to believe that our truth as the left-wing truth is more true than a truth of people who don't exactly follow the same ideological way of thinking as we do, because we live together in the same society. And should we like force all the other people to start believing in like left-wing ideologies, or like what's the solution there?
Please, let's respect the translator.
I just wanted to say that it was not my idea to idealize Sweden. But I would like to point to the fact that in Sweden, Sverigedemokraterna, which is the Swedish Democrats, have up to 17, maybe 20% in polls. In Poland, we have 50% for the very right-wing nationalist party. So that's huge difference, really. And also these ideals, although, as I said, they are not always put into practice, they have political consequences. And this is exactly why Sweden has accepted the biggest proportion of refugees during the recent refugee crisis, proportionally to the number of people who inhabit the country. And of course, it brought about a lot of problems, which are continuous. But in a sense, I would like to stress that although those problems exist, there is a sense of moral obligation which has political consequences in countries like Sweden, while in Poland we didn't accept one person. So in that sense, it is a widely accepted. It is a widely
excuse me,
accepted
I think that we should stop this and allow other people to talk. So I'm sorry, but no. Dorian, talk to the microphone. Okay, no worries. There is another one. Just requests.
So, in my opinion, this is sort of like a tension between like before the French Revolution happened. There was like a constitution that declared the universal rights of man and citizen. So these two things are in place in all of Europe today. These dual ideas of the universal right of man, which is, you know, refugees, everyone outside the border, and citizen, which are actually in today's European politics in exact opposition to one another. So you have the universal right of everyone coming into the country. But actually, that is in opposition to the right of the citizen of that country. So within most European constitutions, you have this idea of the universal right of man and citizen, which is a very historical concept coming from, you know, 1793. It's like this time. So no, but this is coming from the French Revolution. This is coming from like classical liberalism of like, yeah, you have this individual who is supposed to replace the sovereign. But in actuality, this is like this is a dualism that is still at play in all European countries. In actually most countries around the world, you have like this like idea which was supposed to be very humanistic and enlightened, which actually became sort of like, it had tension. Like this one idea had a lot of tension. So this is, you know, now at play in Sweden, this is in play in Poland. So you have a lot of these people who are like, who are for or against one or the other. You have people who are for like this kind of like the right of the citizen, which trumps that of like the other or like man or whoever. So like in my opinion, I think what is needed is like a new constitution that is like no longer a nationalist constitution. You need to have like more like it is just like something that is not necessarily a new idea, but there needs to be more like, yeah, like less like national constitutions, if anything. Like it was really funny. I was just in Catalonia and I read about this crazy performance artist. I can't tell you his name, but what he did for his project, he ate the Spanish Constitution. And I was like, yo, I lost my lid at that. I was like, damn, homie, like that is kind of a nice little sentiment, you know? And he physically ate it, and then the only document that remained was like a photograph of his belly, which was kind of funny too. It was really hairy and, but so in my opinion, I think that this idea of like the universal right of man and citizen, which is like, it's taken over like European politics since you know, the 1790s, that is exactly what's in opposition in every single European country. And in order to like alleviate, whether it's like a refugee problem or anything that's happening with people coming into Europe, what's necessary is like a refinement of that constitution and a delineation of like universal rights rather than universal rights of man and citizen. Because that's what's fucking it up, is that and citizen. It's that like kind of thing that's really there, that is really messing it up.
Well, Dorian, I had another, sorry, there's a little like awful, terrifying fantasy, because if we think that the nation state is something that's like so horrifying and like a mono-party system and like, you know, like mono ideology and then like a mono nation and the mono constitution, what would world look like if there was like one constitution for the whole world? I mean, would it mean that we have one duce and, you know, like, I mean, I just had this like horrifying fantasy. So I think that like, like unification is definitely not the answer. I think that.
But we can make constitutions in different ways.
Yeah.
We can make a constitution which is constantly produced. For instance, I think you were there. You can.
So yeah, I was gonna actually say. So right, like so the UN was supposed to kind of like take off where that left off of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and you know, everyone ratified that, but there have been a number of conventions that the Security Council, particularly the United States, has not ratified or even signed. So you sign. I was just refreshing all of this information that I've never actually formally learned, but I've picked up from just reading and paying attention to different things. But recently, because I just was in a part of this UN event in the UK and had to like act like I knew what the fuck I was talking about. And so when you know a country signs a convention, but then to ratify it means that they actually transfer those laws over onto their national laws, right? So it's not just that you say, well, I affirm that this is a good thing and yeah, everyone should do this. No, you actually enforce it in your own country, right? So the United States and other Security Council members, besides poor exercise of their veto powers is a really egregious way of completely destabilizing and delegitimizing the UN. We have a tendency to sign things, but then not ratify them. I don't think we've even signed the Convention on Torture. And there are some also like the Declaration on the Rights to the Child. I mean, you can actually Google and see a whole Wikipedia list of all of the things that the US has refused to sign and or ratify. And so it's like, yes, we did try, the world tried with the transformation of the League of Nations into the United Nations, with the International Declaration of Human Rights, to actually codify some of these essential human values into law, but then, countries will go and say, well, this is just a suggestion, this is not binding. And so, I mean, how do we ensure that these universal values are actually ratified, are actually enforced within these individual nations when, it goes back to this ultimate question again about nationalism, when those very values somehow are even the subject of contentious debate among the people within those nations?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I guess, off of Dorian's bringing up this idea of the binary between man and citizen, but actually it goes back before. It's central to the construction of sovereignty. So the idea of sacred life and bare life, which of course is what Agamben wrote his book on. The idea that the one who exercises power also has some material form and then as elevated to an effigy form. So this idea of suspending laws and going in between sacred and bare is central to not just the construction of democracy, but also the construction of, it predates your example, basically. Just wanted to bring that up. And then I was thinking this idea about that Eva mentioned we should go back to history before thinking about the future. And I just wanted to bring up that when we think about nationalism, I don't think history is an appropriate term. It's more that nationalism has this kind of when you look at fascist architecture, it's always neoclassical. It's ahistorical. It like reinstates some type of transnational fascistic aesthetics. So I thought that was important to mention, and this idea that, yeah, I think we should talk about history, but of course this history would be an entangled one because the very nature of trauma or violence is one that isn't contained to one nation or one border space, but rather connects to so many different other conflicts. And I've been going back to this metaphor of the boomerang of violence, which you see a lot of Sartre in his, when he is writing the prelude or the introduction to Fanon, or also Aimé Césaire or The Invisible Man. You see the idea of the boomerang effect of violence. And of course it is because when we narrate these types of histories, we have to narrate them as entanglements. And the idea that to narrate one central history is in fact a reconstruction of this nationalistic, grounded, bordered effect. So I was just to go off of that, I think it's necessary as artists are in this space to kind of, as acts of resistance, to construct narratives that kind of defy these types of systems, or go along with more speculative types of thinking, or creating these boomerang effects where we could sort of see a type of history that maybe can exist outside of this nationalistic type of thinking.
I have just one remark about architecture that she was mentioning, and maybe it's interesting also to think that the recuperation of the fascist and Nazi architecture in this neoclassicist style, maybe it's just not just connected with the idea of transnationalism, but also with the attempt to legitimize fascism as the necessary unfold of European enlightenment. Because let's not forget the Germans, they were the ones recuperating the fantasy about Greek. They were the driven force to push, like, we are recuperating this legacy of enlightenment. So maybe it's also connected to a certain epistemology, a certain way of thinking, which is deeper than simply a transnational project. And just to contribute to the idea of the boomerang, there is certain studies in psychoanalysis and psychology, which is the idea of the repetition. No, when the violence is too brutal to be transformed into language, to be able to be worked out as a narration, you have normally in the body sort of you say that motor or a body response to it. Like if you get the case of the hysterical woman, right, in the Victorian times, you would be overly repressed, and then suddenly they were paralyzed, or they will create something in the body as a response to this absurdity violence of the oppression of the male figure that they would not able to narrate. So I think, because I also think that that's something useful for countries like, or peripheral countries, no, to think about certain very brutal violence or very early violence within the social formation that does not allow us to talk or to elaborate within the common sphere the extreme violence that the society is crossed by. So what we tend to do is reproduce, and in the case of Brazil that's quite obvious, because you have massacre in the colonization, you have slave trade, and then you have several dictatorships. Until now we still have an extreme police presence of the police within the public space, torture, persecution, massacre, death, and that's still happening because we are not capable. And when we try and we have like coups and all those processes going on, it's like reinforcing the process of the boomerang, no, or the sense of repetition that it's like a sort of a vertigo of something that we are not capable to cross because we are not capable to transform into representation. We are not capable to talk about, we are not capable to, you know, to take out of this very first expression that is not language.
No, just to to follow on that, I mean, there is the boomerang effect of these fascisms, this boomerang effect of isolationism, but there is a certain boomerang effect, there's a certain circularity that we're not really looking at as societies, as nations, and those are the voices, the histories, the cultures of people who have been silenced and oppressed over the course of our nationhoods, right? And so in the US, you know, and in New Orleans, can of course use the example of indigenous Native Americans, Black people, et cetera, et cetera. There's this whole process in the US, in particular, of the creation of whiteness, right? White supremacy is all, you know, like is this major source of conversation and debate and controversy and outrage right now in the US. But what is really fascinating about whiteness, what is really important to get to the heart of is not just how white supremacy is a violent tool that is oppressing people today and has oppressed people the entire history of the United States, but how whiteness is created and who is able to gain entry and by what process one is able to gain citizenship into the nation of whiteness. And in the US, Irish used to be considered people of color, Italians were people of color, Jews were people of color, and there's been a slow process of allowing people entry into being considered white as a way of constantly reshuffling the way that power and wealth is organized, but ensuring that it still remains in as few as possible hands, ensuring that there is always a perpetual underclass which capitalism necessitates. And those are the Native Americans, the Black people, the people at the total lowest common denominator. But as wealth, as global wealth starts to shuffle, you're even seeing this process of Hispanics begin to gain entry into the world of whiteness, of Asians being able to gain entry into the world of whiteness. And of course, every once in a while you get a Barack Obama, you get an Oprah, you get these people who are allowed to be ambassadors of the underclass into this dominant class. But I mean, it ultimately has to do with the extinguishing of all of these individual cultures, because Black people and Native Americans are not the only people who have suffered through the creation of whiteness and the perpetuation of whiteness, though we have suffered the most, surely. But now all of these white people have also suffered because they've lost their own heritage, they've lost their own cultures. You know, as was discussed, that, you know, in this creation of this mono nation, we're losing so much richness, we're losing so many languages, we're losing so many cultural traditions and modes of dress and dances, and all of these things that wouldn't it be so much more wonderful if we could all just share all of these things openly and engage in them as equals, rather than trying to claim certain histories and use them as weapons to beat over the heads of everyone else. So I think it's really interesting as we start to figure out where to go in the future, and we recognize the dangers of these boomerang effects of nationalism coming around cyclically. We also have to look back at places where we have come from, the things that we do share. There's a book that I always talk about that is kind of like my little Bible called Dancing in the Streets, The History of Collective Joy by an anthropologist named Barbara Ehrenreich. And the book, basically her thesis is like, why is it that we have these carnival traditions in a few places sprinkled around the US and Europe, like in Venice and in Munich and in New Orleans, and then of course throughout the Caribbean and parts of Africa, but what happened to the rest of the US and Europe? Like, why don't we see these festivities of what she calls ecstatic joy, where people, you know, have this moment, this time period, a week or so, where there's no work, there's no school, people are out in the streets, they're dancing, they're masquerading. They were these massively anti-authoritarian traditions that would mock the rich and mock the kings and queens and power figures. Across in New Orleans and across the Caribbean, Carnival has been always a time for revolution. The 1811 slave revolt took place during Mardi Gras in New Orleans. And she says that, you know, every culture used to be like this. The calendar wasn't arranged around weeks and weekends and bank holidays. The calendar was organized around festivities, which happened far more frequently. And over time, those periods of ecstatic commiseration, of coming together, of sharing, of embracing nature, embracing community, were siphoned off and contained and constrained to these few moments where people could actually find time to come together. And that is what we share. And that's something that we still see flickers of in these indigenous communities, in Black communities, in different places around the world. And that's what we need to be trying to return to. And we can present that because we all share in that. I mean, like, we can look at Poland as well and look at these, I'm not going to be able to pronounce the name of the holiday that just passed, and Artur Śmiewski talked to me before about Jadi, and there are all of these traditions that we can also look to here and say, these are the values that we want to uplift. These are the places we should return to and present as our hope for the future.
In the moment before this discussion started, we sort of discussed the issue of work, and I think there is something very, I mean, nationalism is so, how to say, it's such an ideology which neglects the issue of labor, of exploitation, and all these issues. They are sort of not entering there, I think, and what you just said about all these carnival-esque sort of moments, obviously, I mean, there is one thing to be worried about, because carnival usually sort of re-strengthens the rule, yeah? So there is a sort of game or play between the kind of, the time of, you know, theatrical, performative sort of overthrowing of the rule, and then the rule being even stronger after this operation. So this sort of dialectics of the carnival and the monarchy or whatever also exists, but this does not deny the fact that at certain points the carnival time becomes also a moment to at least imagine a different world, a different set of hierarchies and things. But I was thinking of this sort of holidays and joy and collective joy, and I mean, in Poland now we are all our holidays are more or less consecrated to the losses and catastrophes that we went through. So even, I think even this day, this symbolic commemoration of Christ's birth is somehow, I mean, it's hard to transform a birth into a sad moment, but believe me, they're getting there actually. So not even Christmas, you know, like. So I think there is something super dramatic and deeply sad about the way these commemorations of these dramatic messianistic sort of moments is being, it's terrible. So somehow, as a continuation of how do we not continue the kind of wrongdoings of nationalism, I think the celebration of Carnival can actually be an interesting thing. Yeah, so thank you very much for this discussion. It was a wonderful evening. Let's continue over drinks downstairs, and have a good night, everyone. Thanks.